Perfect. Thanks, Al. So welcome those of you who are with us already. I'm sure more people will be joining us as the day morning progresses. But welcome to the repeat session of the Let's Keep Talking About Mappings session. It's the Birds of a Feather session, and we'll be discussing the proposed Fair Mappings Working Group. So my name is Ryan O'Connor. I am working with RDA Europe. I'm part of the RDA Tiger project. And the Tiger project is providing support to this prospective working group. If you could just move on to the next slide, Jan, please. Thank you. Thanks. So as you have heard already, the session is being recorded. I've put a link into the chat to the collaborative notes document. If you could please sign into the attendee sheet there on the kind of part for the repeat session, that would be great. So we will be having a couple of presentations from my colleagues Jan and Jonas, but there will be a section later for discussion and for questions. So please, if you could just keep your mics on mute until then, that would be appreciated. So just a quick review of the agenda before I hand over to Jan. So basically, the session is structured around two questions. So where do we start and where would we like to go? So for the first question, where do we start? I will hand over to Jan in a second, and my colleague Jonas, who will both give an overview of the previous Birds of a Feather session at P21 and other kind of relevant outputs and projects and work done so far. This kind of led up to to bring us to the point where we're working on the case statement for this group. That will then hand over, and Jan will give us an idea of that case statement, the current status, and we'll look a bit more closely at the work plan. And then towards the latter third of the session, we will have an interactive session. So this will involve questions to you as attendees via Slido, and also we'll be able to answer any questions that you might have or queries or comments. And so we will invite you to contribute to the session then. So with that, I will hand over to Jan. Jan, please take the floor.
Thanks, Ryan, and good morning. Thanks for joining the session. That's going to be an intimate session today, at least for now. So indeed, the idea is that we're going to present you a little bit the reasons for that fair mapping working group that we're trying to put together, and we would be really happy to get your feedback on what we are proposing. So my name is Yann Lefranc. For those of if you don't know me, I'm the CEO of a company called eScience Data Factory. We are French-based, and we are contributing actively to the Fair Impact project. And my colleague Jonas is working in the Fair Core for EOSC, and we realized that it would be nice to actually have some joint activity as we are both working on mappings. And we decided, based on some workshops we organized last plenary, which was the International Data Week in Austria. And we organized two workshops to discuss about mappings, because that's kind of one of our main topic of activities. And we wanted to discuss with the different communities to see the interest and also the problems that are faced by the other communities. So we organized two workshops during the International Data Week. One was a generic session on mappings, aiming at presenting our ongoing work from our two projects, Fair Impact and Fair Core for EOSC. And then we had a Bird of a Feather session presenting 13 potential usage of mappings and discuss the relevance of creating an RDA working group to discuss about the mappings and how to make them fair in particular. So during the Bird of a Feather, we had this 13 presentation that shows different kinds of mappings and different usage for mappings. But what was interesting is that, well, there were a lot of people who did not necessarily know how to do that and how to handle mappings. And we asked several questions about the kind of mappings you would do, like what kind of entities would you actually connect together? Well, the answers were everything for those who were actively highly motivated, or mostly it was concept and class from ontologies or controlled vocabularies, properties of the data or the data itself, metadata schemas, or even codes, meaning codes used in standardized code list, like for instance UN generate many of them. And the second questions that we asked was, what would be a compelling output for the RDA working group? So during the discussion, it was clear that there were a lot of communities involved around mapping. Many of them were not necessarily well advanced. They needed some advices and they needed some way to share their mapping more efficiently. So we decided at the end of the workshop, the bird of a feather, to actually create this working group. And we asked, okay, if we do a working group, what should we do? And that's a bit the topic of today as well, is to discuss what we are proposing and to see whether or not we should add something or remove something or change the kind of output we would like to generate from that working group. So in terms of what the community that was present at the first Bird of a Feather wanted to see as an output, we have a terminology on mappings, because indeed mapping is I would say, overinflated terms, because it puts many things together, conflates many things together. We can talk about data mapping, metadata mapping, ontology mapping. We call them all mappings, but it's not clear when we discuss which ones we are talking about. So the idea is to come up with a terminology to clarify and disambiguate conversation between experts. Of course, coming up with use cases so that, well, communities that are starting the mapping process can actually use the use cases coming from other communities to actually get inspiration from. A demo for interoperability, meaning, well, if we're proposing some recommendations on how to make this mapping fair includes interoperability. So can we demonstrate how making the mappings fair increases interoperability? Also coming up with a generic model for sharing these mappings, because right now the most common model to do and share the mappings is CSV. It's just a correspondence table, basically, most of the case. And so we need to see how we can better describe the mappings and share them. Also sharing best practice and how to for all the communities that are starting the mapping journey. They don't necessarily know where to start and how to do them. So basically the idea is to share this best practice from communities that have done that for many years, and to develop a registry or a repository of mapping, which is one of the things that Jonas is going to present later on. So the core of the work that drives this working group is the work we're doing currently in two European projects, Fair Impact and Fair Core for EOSC. And I'm going to talk about my part, which is Fair Impact, and then Jonas is going to talk about Fair Core for EOSC. So Fair Impact, in a nutshell, it's what we call the Coordination and Support Action. It's funded under the European Horizon Europe program. It started about 2 years ago. And the idea is to actually propose and support people in making their data fair by proposing solutions and process and good practices to verify their data. My part in that project, we have a complete work package dedicated on metadata and ontologies, and we have a task on mappings, because you will find out that there are many different ontologies, many different ways of describing things. And when you want to build an information system that aggregates data or metadata from different heterogeneous sources, the naming convention that are used in each of these sources are different. And here is the example. I'm a cat lover, so I like this slide, where basically you could imagine two databases that contains images or data about cats. In one database, it's called domestic cat. In the other, it uses the species name of the domestic cat. The computer cannot know that both are the same. So if you start putting them together, the computer will assume they are different. Well, they are the same in the end. And that's what we need to do, is to provide these mappings and to tell the computer that in the end, domestic cat is the same as Felis sylvestris catus, right? So that when I search across the two databases, I will get a coherent search result that will bring me the content of the two databases. The same you can do for a third one that actually talks about domestic animals, where basically you'd like to say to the computer that, well, cat is a kind of domestic animal, and therefore, if you're looking for cats, maybe you should also provide me data about domestic animals. So the idea of the mapping is to establish links between human concepts that are usable by a machine to actually do something with it. And most of the time, it's for findability, so helping you to find and aggregate data. In practice, whether here I'm showing things on semantics, so it could be the alignment between different ontologies. Here we can think about the mapping, whether it's on ontologies, data, or metadata, as a simple model which links two different entities. And these entities can be anything. It can be data, it can be metadata fields, it can be a concept in an ontology, and so on and so forth. Now, what is important is that these mapping must be documented. That's really a key, because if you just give me a table where you get two columns, one is on the field in the metadata schema 1, and the other one is the field in metadata schema 2, first, I don't necessarily know the relation that links them. The only assumption I can make is that they are equivalent. And I don't know the purpose of your mapping. I don't know in which scope you've done the mappings. I need to know who did the mapping, if I have any question, and so on and so forth. So basically, the idea is that this mapping should also be extensively documented with explanation, license, metadata, and provenance. And then when they are put together, this documented mapping generates what's called a mapping set or a crosswalk. And these crosswalks and mapping set needs also to be documented. So the objective in the mapping task on fair impact is to first establish a guideline on how to make this mapping fair. Right now, they are hard to find, hard to reuse. You need to know exactly where, who has done the mapping so that you can find the Excel spreadsheet that's being used, or even you can find them on GitHub. It's not easy to find with just a GitHub search. So the idea is that we want to come up with some recommendation to actually improve the way we are sharing these mappings. And for that, we want to use the FAIR principle as a core guideline. The second things we're aiming to is to actually propose a machine actionable common exchange model, because when you have this mapping published, you want to use them. And you don't necessarily to do that on your own. You would like to automate the process of using them. And therefore, they need to come up in a machine actionable model or format. The third objective is to engage with communities, right? We can create that on our own corner within Fair Impact in our task. That would be fine. And then we push everything out there. But that's not the point. And the point is that we discuss with all the communities that have created mappings or are in the process of creating mappings so that we can co-create, test, and adopt the model for fair mappings as well as the recommendations. And we can as well identify methodologies and practice around mappings. The fourth objective is to actually establish a governance framework. Once we have created this mapping, at some point they need to be maintained. They will evolve over time because the content they are mapping will also evolve over time. So how do we manage that? What kind of process can we put there? What kind of governance model can we set up? So basically, the way we're seeing that in the task is that we are working on the two sides of the same coin. On one side, we're working on the technical questions. What are the technical recommendations we can make on making mapping fair? And what kind of model can we propose? And on the other side, we would like to focus on the practical aspects of mapping. How do you do a mapping in practice? What do you need to think and prepare before you start doing the mapping themselves? So we started by organizing workshops because that's the best way to engage with communities and to co-create. So we had the first workshop on mappings, which was in 2023, so basically April last year. And we started discussing what would be the requirements for a framework to make this mapping fair. So it was pretty successful. We had 120 registered participants from 24 countries, 24 organizations and communities, 32 domains of knowledge. And we discussed four main topics: the specification of fair mapping connected to the FAIR principles, the types of mappings, because we quickly realized that when people are talking about the mappings, they are not talking necessarily about the same thing. What are the existing tools and the requirements for tools that could be proposed, and what are the methodologies for mapping? So regarding from the output of this workshop and the discussion, we started working internally, taking up all the inputs we collected, and we are working on establishing a first set of recommendations on how to make this mapping fair. So basically, in order to do that, instead of trying to go one individual FAIR principle by one individual FAIR principle, we started to group things because some of the recommendation can actually be useful for at least one or two or more of the FAIR principles. And so we clustered them into four main categories: model and format, which deals with interoperability and reusability; metadata for findability and reusability; PID, or globally unique persistence and resolvable identifier, as it's said in the FAIR principle, which deals with findability; and then service and API for everything that deals with accessibility and also in some part with findability. So our first recommendation that we have been pushing even before drafting the recommendation is about model and format. There are not that many models that exist out there. Again, the most used model is 2-column in a spreadsheet. So if we want to actually better document and better structure these mappings, we need to look into models. There are few of them, and our first recommendation is use SESAM, which is a standard or a model that's coming up from the biomedical community, and that's picking up in many other communities now, because it provides a way to represent mapping in a structured way, with a lot of metadata to document them. And it actually keeps working with the common, format that is used for sharing mappings, which is a tabular format, right? So SESAM allow you to describe a lot of things about the mappings and the mappings themselves, of course, in a table, like you would use Excel spreadsheet. Now, this works really fine when you want to share ontology mappings, which means you would like to connect concepts one to another. That's great. But what happens when you want to do data mapping? Like you would like to connect two data elements and actually specify the transformation that links them, right? Let's say you have a temperature in Kelvin and a temperature Celsius. You'd like to say that they're equivalent if you apply this transformation, right? And this is a mapping, and SESAM is not done for that. What about when you have one-to-many mappings, meaning in metadata elements, in the first one you get full name, in the second one first name, last name. You would like to say that they are equivalent, and there is, for instance, an order, like you need to start with first name and then last name. This is not covered by SESAM. So the question is, how can we then work with SESAM still, but then extend the model so that it covers the other cases? Because one of the things that we identified, and I'm going to discuss in a second on metadata, is that the model metadata description provided by SESAM is actually quite extensive, and we would like to keep it this way, and we would like to reuse it, whether we are mapping ontologies or something else. So what we started working on is to identify in the tables what are the essential columns to describe the mapping, which we call the core mapping model. And we are proposing that instead of coming up with something new, we just change the core model to represent the specific mappings we are talking about. So that basically you would have, for ontology, we use plain SESAM. And if you start looking at data or metadata, you would extend the column and you would add, for instance, the transformation rule or specific additional information you need to express the mapping, like order, when I was saying for full name, first name, last name. As I said, one of the work that we did in the task was to actually analyze the metadata schema from SESM. And instead of going to SESM and then asking questions, we did it the other way around. We worked internally and we collected as many queries we would like to have or we would like to be answered to find mappings. And from this list of queries, we started to identify what are the key metadata elements that needs to be there in the metadata schema so that we can answer all these queries. Once we identified these queries, we came up with a list of 19 metadata fields, I think, which are essential for answering all these queries. And we then compared with SESM, and we realized that SESM covers all the metadata elements we needed. Which leads to the point that one of the recommendations we'd like to make is whether you use SESM or not, go look at the metadata and use the metadata in SESM. Third aspect is on PID and the identifier of mappings, right? So right now, SESM proposed to uniquely identify the mapping set and crosswalks, which is nice. Now, one of the issue is, what if I would like to use one particular mapping in one mapping set and another particular mapping in a second mapping set? They are not identified internally, and therefore I cannot create this composite new crosswalks. So for that, what you need to do is to actually add an identifier for the mappings, the individual mappings, which should be an extension of SESM as well. And then raise the question is, okay, but to actually define my mapping, I need to clearly identify the elements I'm referring to. And that raised the question, how do you uniquely identify the elements of a metadata schema that doesn't have a PID, right? And these are some of these issues that were faced by UNAS, for instance, that is going to slightly mention. The same goes for implementing the FAIR principles in the findability ones. You need to actually provide a unique identifier for the metadata record that specifically points to the data itself. Therefore, you need a fifth identifier for the metadata record that actually should be provided by the mapping repository service where you publish your mappings, right? Because you can actually publish your mapping as well outside of a repository, and that mapping would contain the metadata. So the mapping set or the mapping itself is self-contained, but when you publish it, you need to make that metadata explicit and accessible. Therefore, you need to provide it, an identifier. The second part, and I'm coming up to the end of the work, outside of the recommendation, is to actually work on the practices. So we plan to organize a series of 3 workshops and a survey to actually collect as much information on what are the common practices in different communities. Are there any best practice to do mappings? So we had the first workshop in 23 last year, in November, where the objective was to gather input from communities of practice and to discuss commonality between these community of practice. And one of the outcomes that came out from that workshop is a proposal for a mapping practice framework. We have an open survey, so if you're interested, please do not hesitate to contribute. The link is in the slide. I think you have access to the slides anyway. We are really looking into, well, how do you do mappings in general, and what kind of mapping you're doing. It takes about 25 minutes to fill in the survey, but it's quite extensive because we need quite in-depth information. And we had recently, last month, yes, a second workshop with the idea that, well, we have a framework, great, now we need to test it with the communities that already have done mappings. And the idea is to collect as much feedback to improve the framework. And here's a small, short representation, and I'm not going to detail it extensively. So basically, we looked at the process of doing mappings, and we identify 5 different steps. You have a pre-mapping step where you need to define what do you want to map, what is the scope, why do you need it, start providing the context of the mapping, how you're planning to do that, is there any rules that you would like to impose on the way you do mapping. Then there is the mapping step where you do the mapping effectively. Once you've done the mappings, then there is a review process. And based on the outcome of the review, whether it's good, then you move to hosting, which means publishing and making it available, and the maintenance. And if the review doesn't pass because there are problems with quality, then you go back to the initial step and you redo the mapping so that you can correct. And that's it for me. So if you have any questions, you can always just ask, no worries. Now I'll give the floor to Eunice. Do you want to share your screen, Eunice?
Or we can actually, yeah, actually, let's do that. That's what we did last time.
Just
Yeah. Yes. Hello, everybody, on my behalf too. So my name is Joonas Kesäniemi, and I work for the CSC in Finland, the Center for Scientific Computing. And for the past couple of years now, I've been working mainly on this FAIR Core for EOS project and one particular mapping-related work package. And I will give a poor overview of the project because there's usually somebody else who's doing this, but I want to highlight that we are now on month 19 of the project, so one more year to go, about one more year to go. You can see the full name there, and in as opposed to FAIR Impact project, the FAIR Core for EOSC is a research and innovation action. So we are building components, we are building services, and I think these two projects are perfect companions, or complementary projects, and as if they were designed like that. I don't know. It's a consortium of 22 partners and coordinated also by the CSC, and Tommi Suominen is the one who usually gives presents this part. I want to just show all the components we are working on, and then we are going to be focusing on the one in the middle up row, so the metadata schema and crosswalk registry, which supports the publishing, discovery, and access of metadata schemas and provide functions to operationalize the metadata conversions by combining crosswalks. That's the original description. And I also want to highlight a couple of the things that have been added or negotiated during the project. So we have collaboration with some additional partners, for example, the BioDT, who are working on this biodiversity digital twin, and we are discussing the kind of mappings that they need and they want to do, and we are working on within the MSCR, so the work package that I'm working on, also to help them. There is some similar collaborations with the BitInst Future, and as well as the Switch, which is the national, or it's a similar organization to CSC in Switzerland, and especially in the Connect to Me project, they have been creating these mappings between so-called legacy formats and RDF, and we are working with them with when it comes to the operationalization or operationalization of the mapping, so turning one data set into another. But with that as a segue, let's go into the fun stuff. So the component that I'll be talking about is the metadata schema and crosswalk registry, and this is the one that I've been focusing my work on. So to try to put it shortly, these are the main functions that the MSCR provides. So you can register existing schemas and crosswalks in multiple formats. So you can have schemas. The requirement is that you have a description of a schema, and it could be PDF, which is of course something that we can't work on, but you can do that because a lot of the content for both schemas and crosswalks is for human consumption only, and they are something that can be used as a basis for creating more machine readable versions of those schemas and crosswalks. And then you can have the CSV, both schemas and crosswalks, and in XML schema, JSON schema, you can have ontologies like OWL ontologies, shackle versions, and on the right hand side there you can see the MSCR glossary. So we consider the schema quite broadly. So for example, vocabularies are schemas to us. So you can have a SCOS vocabulary as an existing schema that you can register. And what the MSCR does, it provides this harmonized view to all of those schemas. So basically, they all, once they have been registered, you can work on them in a harmonized way. And what you can do with those schemas is create the crosswalks using the included tool within the MSCR. So we have implementing this crosswalk editor where you can start with the you select the specific version of a source schema and specific version of a target schema, and then you can create the mapping between those. So, or you can create a crosswalk between those, because so I try to talk about mappings and a individual mapping as a link between two property sets. So something from the source, some parts of the source, how they are mapped to some parts of the target schema. And a collection of those mappings is a crosswalk. And then finally, the goal is to also, I'm using this facilitate word there to keep it a bit vague for now, but we are going to facilitate the operationalization of the crosswalks. So the goal is to also provide the services or the components that you can run in your own data centers, where you can take the crosswalk, the source, the input data, so those data instances adhering to the source schema, run them through the component and come up, and that would be, the data would be transformed into another data set that then confirms to the target vocabulary. And the nice thing about this setup is that you have the crosswalk, which has explicit links to those both schemas, the target schema and the source schema and the target schema. So you can do validation of the data both before you start the transformation process and after the transformation process is completed, to verify that you're getting what you actually are meant to be getting. And the MSCR also handles versioning. It assigns handle identifiers for all the schemas, registered schemas, and all the registered crosswalks, and all individual mappings within those crosswalks also have identifiers that can be resolved, but they are part identifiers. So all the handles, all the mapping identifiers are they are in the context of the crosswalk, and this is by design, because the mappings are usually very context sensitive. So that's the reasoning behind it. The type of mappings that the MSCR supports are, and these are the ones that Jan has already mentioned. So semantic mappings, and for example, between classes or between vocabulary concepts. Structural mappings, so you are able to restructure data or convert formats going from XML to JSON or CSV to RDF. And then also value or data mapping. So I've been talking about value mappings, but probably the more common word is data mapping. So so when you have properties in the schema where the values, they might come from a certain list of terms, so it could be a vocabulary, it could be a enumeration, or it could be that the value of the property needs to be converted somehow. So this was the function that Jan mentioned. So it could be a unit conversion, it could be some kind of a rearrangement of the content, or whatever. It could be just data type conversion. So you go from string to a number. And to make this more concrete, there are a couple of examples that you could, or you might have already run into. So for example, the CSC is running this research.fi national quiz system that has activity code list. And there is this credit taxonomy, which is quite, well, it has like 10 different things, and the research.fi activity code list has about 200 different codes. So what is required if you want to do this kind of mapping is to many-to-one type of mapping. So for example, in the source side, we have these different kinds of supervisor of doctoral and so on activities. They might be mapped to supervision in the credit taxonomy. Then a different kind of mapping that is kind of like many-to-one, but a structural mapping would be that the role in research output part of the schema that has 3 different elements. So first names in output, family name in output, and other name in output. That needs to be transformed into display person name. So you need to rearrange or arrange those values in those different fields into a specific order, and they put them into this one property. And then a common thing that might be needed is when it comes to for example, POI identifiers, how they are expressed in different systems. They might use the same metadata schema, but the values might be expressed in different ways. They might have different conventions. So it could be that you want to go from the URL version to just the identifier part, or you might want to append or add a prefix to the value, or you might want to have just these generic identifier elements that are classified by an attribute. So you want to select a specific identifier element where the type is DUI, and then handle those in a specific way. And then the mapping of vocabulary values. So this 11.1.1 role code is actually the supervisor of doctoral candidate. That is the value of from the research.fi code list, and that needs and you want to go from that into something like presented here. So this was the example given in the credit taxonomy website as a way to represent those values. But then there are issues. So if you have done mappings in any way, the things aren't usually that simple. So you might get quite far by very simple mappings, but at some point you will come across some complex cases, and those cases could be that it's structural complexity, it could be a semantic complexity, it could be syntactic complexity. And for example, this is an example where we are trying to map. So this is one of the case studies in the project that basically try to solve the problems that those case studies have with the components that we're developing. And here is an example where the role in the research input, so the role code in this case is mapped to a serif scholarly publication module data model. And here what you would need to do is you would need to create a credit contribution statement. So RDAVP22 that has a specific type. And then what you would also need to do is, if you have a lead type of investigation role in the source data, you would need to somehow split it into role type attribute, and for example have an investigation value there, and then degree of contribution attribute. which is or a property, which then the value could be lead. So coming up a configuration or UI where you can do that is tricky. And also this kind of structural complex mapping. So what we have right now is this kind of a forum for individual mapping. So basically there's a first step towards the metadata about mappings, so you can have a node. But as Jan described, the SESOM has a very nice mapping metadata model, and we intend to implement that within the MSCR. But this is the start. And what you can now do is create a simple one-to-one mapping, and you can select the predicates. So we have basically the SCOS predicates available right now. But based on the analysis of the case studies that we have, this is something that we need. So you need to be able to filter elements from the source data. So for example, filtering all the identifiers where the some attribute value is DOI. You need to be able to do different kinds of operations. So these three operations, the source, mapping, and target operations, actually come from SESOM model. And you need to be able to add different kinds of parameters to those operations. So you might have exactly the same mapping even multiple times in the crosswalk, just with different kinds of parameters. So this is what we're aiming for. But then the benefits that you can get by using something like metadata schema and crosswalk registry to define those crosswalks. The mappings are stored in a structured machine readable format. So it is the internal format or kind of like custom format, but we will provide both export and import of this standard. So upcoming de facto or standard format. So SESOM is now on the roadmap, but of course, as Jan mentioned, or what mentioned in the introduction, that the working group is coming up is working on a kind of like more or mapping format that could cover more different kinds of mappings. So that would be the natural extension to the MSCR. Yeah, as I mentioned, the source and target schemas are available for validation also for the PDF versions of crosswalks. So even though they only implement the only kind of like the crosswalk would not be expressed in something that you can run directly, you would still have these links to the source and target schemas for validation. Or if the crosswalk implementation is an XSLT and you don't know how to check if the XSLT actually works, then you can use those schemas for validation. And then the experts of both sides, so this means that you might have a person that knows the target schema and you had another person who knows the source schema. They can work together with a common format and tool, which is the MSCR UI. Of course, you can do this already with those spreadsheets, but then the added value here is that then you would create the mappings you're creating together is something that can be operationalized immediately. And then as a final benefit, the idea, so what the MSCR is creating is basically a knowledge graph of mappings. So in the back end, as I've been mentioning, that we support these different type of schemas. So the kind of like technical formats like XML and JSON, the vocabularies, the ontologies. So what we end up creating is a knowledge graph that combines the schemas, the mappings, the vocabularies, the ontologies, and then also actually these functions. So internally there's a semantic functional descriptions, and all of those are linked, and all that information can be queried and it can be used to help the user to create those mappings and propose, maybe suggest mappings or even generate mappings based on the kind of information that we can infer or we can query from the graph. And finally, the timeline. So by summer, we're hoping to get first operationalization implementations available, something simple. By fall this year, we aim to have support for more complex mappings, for example, this many-to-one and the value transformations. And by winter next year, hopefully we can open up the release environment so to public testing. So there is already form in our website where you can submit and express your interest towards the component of the Faircore for JOSC. But unfortunately, it's going to take until we are in the state where the MSCR is something that someone outside the core project group should start testing it. That will be hopefully early next year. And then in May, everything is working perfectly because the project ends and all the case studies and requirements are fulfilled, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Any questions before we move to the next topic?
There's a question from Rolf in the chat saying, is the MSCR in production?
Yeah.
Yes. So unfortunately, the yes was not the answer, but the answer is that there is a plan for sustainability of these different components happening within the project, and of course the goal is to have it in production by the end of the project, and hopefully we can do that.
I see now. Sorry, Ralph had said that the slide you already answered it in the presentation. Sorry.
Yeah. But if I can answer the Alex's comment about the different catalogs. So as part of the work, or actually a demonstrator of the MSCR, what we are doing is we're seeding the metadata registry, and there we are using the RDA metadata standards catalog as one of the source of that seeding material. So basically schemas that are deposited there or maintained there.
See Clément raised a hand. Clément?
Yes, thank you, Jan. My question is for you, Jonas. I mean, I'm in the family of work here, so I'm pretty knowledgeable about the work presented and all of that. So I'm gonna ask you a tricky question, but that is related to the side functionality of the mapping of the MSCR, and come to my mind recently, and I had a chance to ask you before. So let's go. We are reporting in another task in Work Package 4 of Fair Impact. So with Jan, we work on the mapping, and on task 4.2, we work on the semantic artifact catalogs. All of that is being linked in the same work package, of course. And so part of this task, we are listing. We have a deliverable where we list many, hopefully quite exhaustive list of semantic artifact catalog, their role, registries, libraries, etc. So we came to the point, shall we mention the MSCR there because of the side effect of being a catalog of semantic artifacts being understood at the large sense of that. So do you recommend us to list it? And so even if the core functionality of the MSCR is the mapping repository, but shall someone use it, or at least should we list it to show that this is also some way of hosting, or at least listing, because we take registries, repositories, but also listing websites, things like that.
Yeah, well, but I have to say that register schemas is also an important part of the MSCR, and I think the tricky part here is not whether it supports or it's a registry of schemas or registry of crosswalks, but it is whether there is a service to point to. So if you are registering software solutions that can be used as like a semantic artifact registry, then definitely I would say that MSCR should be there. But if you need a service that is being maintained and there is an owner and so on and some kind of that is a trickier answer then. So hopefully we will know by the end of the project. I'm deferring, like dodging the question a little bit, because I'm trying to focus on the implementation, and I usually talk about the MSCR component, not the MSCR service, but to try to make the distinction that we are working on the functionalities and the features. But yes, so depending on what is your angle, then then I think it could fit there very well and should be there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, our sole quality of selection was the fact that it doesn't host only one schema. So as soon as you start working with multiples, then okay, good.
Thank you, Clément. Any other question? If not, then I'll jump into the next part of the presentation of today. Sorry, which is the main point of today, is discussing about the creation of a mapping working group, or fair mapping working group. So after the last plenary, we started putting together a group of people who were interested or actually expressed interest in contributing to this mapping working group and the creation of this working group. And in order to do that, we need to write a case statement for the group that we will then submit. Well, sorry, Zoom is doing weird stuff. If I do this, it should. Anyway. So basically, the idea is to discuss now where we are regarding the case statement. So we have been working, we had 3 different workshops. Here you have the link to the latest version of the case statement and the charter. We had 3 workshops over the course of the past 4 months, during which we actually discussed extensively the charter, which is what is the objective of the group, what kind of problem do we want to solve, and what kind of output do we want to generate at the end of the working group. And so we managed to actually converge on this charter and the list of outputs, and also on the added value for people that will benefit from these outputs. So what we would like to discuss today and present to you is this list of outputs, list of problems we aim to solve with this working group, and to discuss with you if it's fine, if you find interest in these outputs, or if we should redefine it, if they are clear enough, or on the contrary, we need to further describe them so that we clarify a little bit where we're heading. So regarding the main problems we're trying to solve in this working group, one of them is the fact that the mappings are hard to find and hard to reuse, right? So, I mean, there's no special way of finding them on GitHub. In many cases, they are stored there. They're just Excel spreadsheets, and sometimes they are not even well documented or described, so you cannot necessarily find them easily unless you know people who have been working on that, or sometimes Google gives you some strange results and you end up finding something. But that's related to the second problem is that basically these mappings are scattered across version control systems, which make them harder to find. They are expressed in formats that are not meant for automated processing, and so using mapping in practice requires some automation. Mapping is already a manual process in many cases. It can be semi-automated, but then what about their usage? And that should be automated. And also, I'm going back to this topic that we realized that the meaning of the term mapping itself is context sensitive and is leading to a lot of ambiguities. In many cases, in the workshops we organized or the different meetings, even internally within our own group in Fair Impact, we ended up talking about completely different things without noticing. And then at some point, at the middle of the discussion, you realize that you're not talking about the same thing. So we need to disambiguate and clarify things. So basically, these are the core problems that the working group aim to solve. And to do that, we're proposing a list of 5 outputs. We would like to actually provide the technical recommendations to make mapping fair, and of course, an associated fairness evaluation grid, so that, well, you can actually test whether or not your mappings are fair. We would like to come up with a harmonized mapping use case collection, because all the work we are planning to do should be grounded on practical things, on use cases or case study if you want. But we really want to actually get grounded on practical things or concrete things. Based on this use case collection, we're planning then to work on the mapping classification / ontology. Because, well, it depends on the resources. Building an ontology is time consuming. We may not be able to do that over the course of the 18 months of the mandate of the group, but we can start initiate things on classification for sure, and we'll see where we can go. So that's why we don't want to make a strong commitment on the final format, but at least a clear terminology classification of the mapping should come up from there. And these should be linked with actually concrete use case. Generic exchange model and the associated metadata for publishing mappings, and what we call the fair mapping knowledge base. Okay. So regarding the harmonized mapping use case collection, we want to have a representative collections of the different types of mapping scenarios. We want to understand what are the different types of mappings, data mappings, but yes, it's vague. Are there subtypes, metadata, and so on. And in the meantime, we'd like to have the context of their usage. For what purpose do you want to do this? Is it for data integration, for data retrieval, for findability, and so on and so forth? So in order to do that, there are multiple collection methods that we can use. Questionnaire, we can have interviews, also literature review. But of course, our aim is to say we are building this working group on RDA communities, and we would like to get in touch with these communities that are interested, including existing working group and interest group. I'm thinking about the metadata interest group that already did some mapping. There is the scientific knowledge graph working group that are currently generating mapping. So the idea is to collect as many use cases we can from the communities and to harmonize their descriptions so we make sure that they can be compared one another, and actually we can use that information. You don't have to how to say, chase people many times. So we'll try to come up with that. And this source of information is going to be published, and it's going to be used to create a knowledge base, so that actually if you're looking for what kind of use cases actually are dealing with mapping, the context, the usage, the examples of mappings that are generated, and so on, so you can retrieve that information. Based on this output, we'll build the mapping classification / ontology. The idea is from the use case, we identify the different types, and we use examples to create the proper definitions and classification. And then, of course, that means that we're not going to reinvent the wheel. There are people that have been thinking about that before us in different ways. And so we want to leverage what's been done. So for instance, the brokering working group has come up with some mapping classification for API. The semantic mapping vocabulary has been developed alongside with SESOM. So we are going to work with these people and with these initiatives to actually extend, enrich, reuse part of it, or the complete solution, so that this can come up as a proper output. The main constraint on that is that if we create such a classification, it's just not going to be a PDF. It must be a machine-readable classification or ontology that's can be used in information systems, and in particular to structure the knowledge base. Then there is the generic exchange model, where, as we discussed, as I presented in the Fair Impact presentation, we want to use SESOM as a basis. There are things that needs to be tweaked in SESOM. We want to keep the main metadata skeleton because we believe that the metadata hold for most of the cases. So if we have a harmonized metadata to describe the mappings, make things easier to find the mappings. The only thing that will need to be changed is going to be the core model that represents the mapping, which means the link between entities and the entities themselves. And for that, we're going to use the use case to actually come up and develop specific models for the different types that could be just hooked to the SESOM model. And then we have this idea of building a knowledge base. We don't know necessarily the form yet. It could be a simple text file containing RDF that you can upload in a graph database on your own and make some search. It can be many different formats. We haven't decided yet, but the main idea is to say, okay, we are collecting a lot of information. We want to aggregate them, right? Because the classification is based on the use case, the models is based on the use case. So we would like to create a resource that allow anyone who would like to search how to publish and share and how to build data mapping of this kind to actually be able to find this information. Now, one of the things that we will need to work along for the duration of the working group is, of course, discussing the sustainability model and the format with which we want to use to share that information. But the idea is that in the end, it's a sort of searchable documentation on mappings, so that actually it's easy to use the outputs of the working group. And then we have the FAIR recommendation, although it's driven by the FAIR impact. FAIR impact is coming to an end next year. And the idea is that within the working group, we can extend the work of FAIR impact to publish it as a RDA recommendation to actually collect more inputs, not only for European countries, but also from the rest of the world, so that we come up with a sort of international consensus on how to make mapping fair. And of course, the idea is that you get an evaluation grid that comes with it, so that if someone wants to develop a service to actually evaluate fairness, that can be done easily. So these are the outputs. This is the charter. We started drafting things. We would be happy to get your inputs directly on the document. We also started working on the work plan. And in order to do that, we started to look at the planned activities for the group. And what does it mean how do we come up with these outputs? So basically, there are different types of activities. Regarding the FAIR mapping recommendation, the idea is to revise them. So FAIR Impact is going to release the first version hopefully soon, before summer. The idea is that one of the first tasks of the working group is to read through the recommendation and come up with feedback. The idea is that we can then improve the content and release a second version with the feedback from the group. In order to collect the use case, we need to agree on a harmonized template for the use case and identify the key information we need and how it should be structured so that we can go to the communities and you can contribute with your use cases. Of course, we need to get the use cases and onboard communities, so we'll organize workshops and different activities. And then for the classification, we need to identify the different ontologies that exist that describes mapping. There are not that many, but we need to look into them. And we need to start thinking on how we can reuse bits and pieces and how we start building our own classification. Then we need to work with the SESM colleagues to define the core mapping model and see how we can expand SESM. And in particular, once we have collected the use cases, we can then start creating the generic model for a specific mapping type. And then toward the end of the working group, start creating the documentation, guideline, and knowledge base, right? So one of the core activities is also contributing to workshops and organizing workshops. Now, how we're planning to do that is we are looking for building a group of motivated people to work with us on this. We get the opportunity to do that in context of our project, which means that at least some of us are funded, which means that we can dedicate time and effort. But we want also to rely on communities that need to actually work on these mapping issues to work with us. There are different topics. So one of the ideas would be to create subgroup for specific topics, like a subgroup for the classification ontology, a subgroup for collecting use cases and analyzing the use cases, another group for FAIR recommendation, and so on. Of course, that will depend on the number of active members. But even if the subgroups, even if you're in a subgroup, that doesn't mean you cannot be in another, right? So basically, it's open. There are not closed groups of people. And the idea is that for the thematic subgroup, we'll meet weekly or bi-weekly, depending on the work to be done and the availability of each other. And for the main group, we'll meet once a month so that we can actually discuss how the subgroups are working together and the progress. In terms of communication tools, we'll use the RDA platform for doing that. Everything is going to be open, which means that even if you're not in the group, you can always contribute to the outputs with your feedback, and you can always come to us. And we are going to see, we had a proposition for setting up a Mattermost channel for asynchronous communication. We could also use a Slack channel that we use, for instance, in the vocabulary and semantic service interest group as well for asynchronous communication. So I'm done talking too much already. Do you have any questions, feedback, or things that you would like to share about the outputs? I plan to do a Slido, so we can start with the Slido. Let's see, messages on live messages. Yep, okay. So let's start with the Slido. Share. So you can join the Slido here. And oh shit, sorry, doesn't work. Yes. Okay, so first question is, are the working group outputs clear enough? We just want to make sure that, well, we are clear on what to expect from the group. Okay.
I was thinking, sorry to interrupt you, Jan, but also if anyone in the participating in the session have some mapping things that they've been doing or they are doing, that this would be we could discuss those too, since we have the time.
Well, they're planning to do as well. Yeah. Right? I mean, that's the thing. Okay, so it seems that at least we're clear on the outputs we want to deliver, which is a good thing. I'll move along to the next question. Do you think our objectives are realistic? That's a tricky question. We have been asking ourselves the same thing. It sounds like a huge amount of work. However, as I mentioned, we do have 1 year of funding, Jonas and myself, and some of the contributors of Fair Impact and Faircore for EOSC are going to join as well, the group. So we do get some core people funding funding for people. We could also leverage some funding from RDA. As far as I know, that there is a grant mechanism that we can ask for working group for dedicated work. However, I mean, it's still a lot of work. So we're just wondering, I mean, are we promising too much?
And related to this, there was a discussion in the previous instance of this BoF that maybe there should be some kind of MVP description, so that there is because it's a bit difficult to say if it's realistic or not, because it's difficult to figure out the scope of those different deliverables, but if they could be very clear about the minimum things that we aim to provide in a bit more detail, and that could be made this kind of judgment easier.
Thanks, Jonas. Maybe we can move to the next. What do you think we should add to the working group description, outputs, or remove? Actually, I forgot to add remove in that question. But if you think there are things we shouldn't just get out of the core work, I mean, this is really an open-ended question, so. That's a good answer. Don't know. And of course, this is the interactive session, so we use the Slido to guide some of the questions. But if you have any comments, or if you want just to discuss, I mean, that's time for it.
For example, your own experiences with mapping exercises, whether they've been theoretical or something that is in production.
Okay. Moving to the last question, which output would be most valuable for you? Right, so we presented 5 different outputs. We'd like you to let us know which ones you would really be happy to see happening. Right, that really be useful for you. Okay, so we have first mapping recommendations, which is good. So it's coming up soon, at least the first version. Then the ontology and mappings or classification, and then the generic mapping model. Okay.
I think this is a nice output because, yeah, the use case collection is maybe more of a source versus a source data for the others a little bit. So did we have this question in the previous session?
I
By
think
the
so.
way,
Yes.
okay, I have completely forgot about that.
Okay, great. I'm actually interested because the generic mapping models come third. So then what does it mean? So does it mean that you have already a way to represent mappings that you're happy with and you're using, or you don't care about sharing mappings? that's also a way of things. Okay, so that was the last question. Every time Zoom detects my thumb, he makes a +1. That's Zoom AI is not really it's not AI at all. All right, so anything you would like to discuss or any specific questions you may have?
I could take this opportunity to promote. There was a question about the relationship maybe between the MSCR and the RDA registry, and there's a small paper coming out from the UNIS conference proceedings about MSCR. So there are a couple of details there and background information that could be helpful.
Okay, so if there's no, I think maybe we can stop here. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I think if people are satisfied by what they've seen so far and they don't have any specific comments to anything to bring up. So what I will add is though that the I have put a link to the current version of the case statement. So obviously that goes into more detail about what the group is planning to do. And I think we're still at the stage where we're inviting comments on that. So we have gone through a couple of iterations, but I think we're close to the final version of this. But please, I'll paste it into the chat again just so people have it close to hand for reference. But we do invite people to comment on that. But I do, yeah. So we are looking to finalize that relatively soon. I think within the next few weeks. We have done a lot of work on this already. We've had the 3 kickoff meetings and obviously the meetings that took place back in Salzburg too. And yeah, so we will be adding or getting that finalized and setting up the group sort of officially on the RDA website as part of the community review setup and the RDA tab review and all that. So we will be reaching out to everybody who's signed in today and to the previous session and to those who've joined us on the kickoff meetings previously and inviting people to join the actual working group on the website. So as Jan said, when we do join the working group, we are inviting people to contribute, but just joining is no sort of requirement on you to contribute actively. Obviously, we would prefer that, but if you want to just be kept up to date with the group's activity, then that will be the best place. But obviously, the more hands that can contribute, the better.
Yeah, that's true. Well, of course, you can sign up to the group, but we would be happy to have more active people joining us. That's one of the things. In any case, I mean, in terms of planning, we're hoping that we will be able to start the activities of the group in September, once we passed all the different reviews process.
One final point is that we do still need additional co-chairs for the group. So I will put a link into the chat. So if you were interested, if you know someone who might be in a position to take up a co-chair role with this group alongside Jan and Jonas, there's a very short form there. It's basically just name, address, and a sentence or two on why you might be interested. And we invite people to fill that out if possible, or get in touch with either Jan or Jonas or myself, and we're happy to chat through that as well.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
I think that's it. So no other comments then. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot for joining this repeat session. It was useful to say it again.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
we are consistent across presentation. And well, we're hoping to see you in the working group and your contribution. I mean, again, contributions can be simply giving us a use case and use case description. It can be coming and discussing about ontology design or classification, or just providing feedbacks on the outputs that are going to be shared on a regular basis. So contribution doesn't have to be that extensive. Okay. So it was nice having you all. I wish you a good week. And thank you for joining this session. See you at the next plenary.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thanks all. Thanks for joining. Bye bye.